Hello, I'm Ken Hickson. I'm Vice President of the Miracle Mile Residential Association. Welcome to the MMRA channel. This is the first of an ongoing series of programs discussing topics and issues regarding the Miracle Mile in Los Angeles. The theme of this program is the Miracle Mile in three tenses: past, present, and future. Our guests are eminently qualified to explore the subject. Ruth Wallach is head of the University of Southern California's Architecture and Fine Arts Library, and Greg Goldin is an architectural writer and critic and longtime resident of the Miracle Mile. Ruth is the author of a new book entitled Miracle Mile in Los Angeles, Architecture and History, and Greg is co-author with Sam Lubell of a new book entitled Never Built Los Angeles, and co-curator of the exhibition of the same name at the Architecture and Design Museum on Museum Row in the Miracle Mile. Let's get started. Let's begin with the developer who put us all here, A.W. Ross.
Yes, and somebody probably should research a little bit more and write a kind of a biographical length study. I don't know if it deserves to be a book length study. I don't know. Certainly one of the people who probably deserves more attention than he's gotten, I think. Or maybe it's because I just finished, this book and I'm still thinking about him. But my sense of him was he lived a long life. I guess he was around 90 when he died or thereabouts.
Yeah, he was quite old.
Quite old. And he seems to have been continuously involved with Miracle Mile since he strong-armed city council to rezone it, and rethinking the role of development in Miracle Mile.
Yeah, there's no doubt that he plays a pivotal role, actually I think, in the history of Los Angeles, because the battlefront was over conceiving of Wilshire Boulevard as essentially a residential street. And if there was going to be mercantile or commercial development, you had to do it plot by plot. Each time you had to go to the city council and say, we want this plan to be approved. And there was no overall zoning of the boulevard. It was not a commercial stretch. And so he had this vision to convert it along its length into a commercial stretch, or at least what we call the Miracle Mile. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. Because without that form of zoning, you couldn't get what did the critics say, that it was going to become New York. Even then they complained about the city becoming New York or Chicago.
That's true. Not everybody wanted that, but he did. I don't know if he had the vision of Manhattan or of Chicago necessarily. Maybe it was a composite. And I was thinking about that as I just now walked along Wilshire Boulevard again and looked at the Desmonds building, and I don't know why it didn't occur to me before, but on the eye level, it's actually just a massive building. There is nothing decorative about it. It's just this big building. You have to look up to see the bas reliefs and all of that. And so perhaps he was thinking of Manhattan, but I don't know. He just had these concepts.
Well, actually, I think the detailing of the Desmonds building goes all the way down to the, whatever that is, the base shoe around the building, and then there is some decorative work.
In the entryway, too.
Yeah, and then the bays that were created that flank the entryway, those are small with the curved glass. I think those are only 12 feet wide. Which is like Hollywood Boulevard, where every storefront is between 12 and 16 feet wide. So it's conceived as something of a walking street, but of course the flip side is the whole back of it was really the entrance.
Yes,
which was true for all of Wilshire Boulevard.
And I was wondering, for those of you who live essentially in the Miracle Mile area, the changes in the last however many years you've lived here, and the disappearance, I think, of some of the parking lots in any case. I remember there was a parking lot on Wilshire and Hauser where Coulter's used to, I guess, stand on Broadway. So there was something like of a parking lot. And then
it was gigantic.
Gigantic, and there is this apartment building that was built on Ridgely, which I think was a parking lot as well. Just sort of the disappearance of that. I mean, what does it mean for people who live on Miracle Mile?
Well, it's a transformation. clearly. And the neighborhoods, I think it's becoming more dense, although I keep thinking to myself secretly that nobody lives inside of these very, very cheaply slapped up apartment buildings that are replacing both the parking lots behind, but also in the case of Coulter's, which was Broadway at the southeast corner of Hauser and Wilshire, that got torn down many years. How many years? 20 years before they finally got around to building something there. But then the next block, from Ridgely to Burnside, that had let's see, there was, the corner building was what? You have it in your book.
One is not Phelps Turkel, but
no, it was a Blewett.
Mullen and Blewett.
Mullen Blewett, right? A beautiful brick with this clock on this. It was a really lovely building, clear span floors that were, poured in place concrete. It was a really nice building, and then next to that was kind of a sort of 1930s or early 1940s building where the LA Reader was, and behind that again was parking. They just wiped those buildings out. Yeah. The same thing has happened kind of in a checkerboard fashion along the north side of the street. And to me, the problem is not so much that there's this change, it's the form that the change has taken. If you're going to have mixed use, which I think is probably a favorable direction for the city, at least demand that what you get is architecture and building standards that are the equivalent of what you're tearing down. And that's the problem. If you look at the corner of La Brea and Wilshire, where yes, there's that massive apartment complex, that's type 5 construction, which means all it is stick and stucco. It's built the same way that the apartments around here were built, except that the finishes are just completely crappy. And everybody knows that's destined to be gone 10 years from now. It will be shabby. It might still be standing, but it will be a shabby reminder of the cheapness and the unwillingness of the city to follow, Ross's original vision. So that I don't think that the issue is so much that, you're filling in the parking. Something had to happen there. It's really not the highest use of land. But why does it have to be crap?
Why does it have to be crap? It's because we are beholden to developers, but it's not just so simple as that, I don't think. Sort of think about the exhibition that you organized, co-organized and co-curated. One way to think about the development of Los Angeles is to have developers on the one hand, people like Ross, people like others, Flint in the LA area, and so on and so forth, Fritz Burns. And on the other hand, these phantasmagoric visions of some futuristic LA. And I think what we are trying to figure out is this very large stretch of in-between. Ross didn't have, I don't think, a vision of sameness necessarily, doesn't seem so. Some of the other developers just sort of, it was all very prefabricated, and you throw something up and all of a sudden there was a neighborhood in a matter of a couple of months. But at the same time, you've got all this crazy stuff that draws people to an exhibition, and what's in between. And I think Miracle Mile might be an example of that in-betweenness. But I agree with you. Some of the development that we see is cheap, and I almost long for the bank building and the church that used to be there on that corner of Wilshire and La Brea, even though I think a lot of people didn't like it. I mean, I don't think of modern architecture as being nice. Still, it was interesting.
In its own right, it was a really good example of what's called brutalist architecture. And I think it was a powerful statement. It's true, you might not like it, but in terms of the quality of the building, the integrity of the architecture, the statement that it made, you just superimpose it over what they've now built, and you're going to be longing for that thing.
Yes. Nostalgia strikes.
Yes, eternally. Yeah. And it's compounded by other difficulties, because there's nothing that says when you put in a building like the one at La Brea, not to dump on that excessively, but there's nothing in the city of Los Angeles that requires any kind of social component. There's nothing that they have to do to dedicate a real park as opposed to some little tiny sliver of land. There's nothing that requires them to put solar arrays on top of the building to make it energy neutral. There's nothing that says that the finishes that they use or the level of what's the word I'm looking for here? Insulation or anything, soundproofing, to make those livable apartments, places that people would desire to be in rather than rabbit warrens. And so it goes. So we have no overarching kind of design or social policy to bring those two ends that you're talking about, the completely kind of wildly conceived dream or just the developers counting their money
Per square foot.
per square foot, right? There's nothing that compels anything else in this city. We don't have a planning department that has any real power. We don't have a planning czar. We don't have a Robert Moses. We have a mayor who doesn't actually have invested in the office the power to do anything. And then you've got the city council people who, each one of them, all you have to do is give them the right contribution, your building goes up.
So I noticed also, speaking of buildings going up, that the eastern edge of Miracle Mile all of a sudden seems maybe within the span of less than a decade is bounded by these massive structures where Carnation used to be and the Llewellers Cadillac showroom. There are all these very large structures. A type of Manhattanization without necessarily being like Manhattan happening. And I don't expect this will happen going westwards because some of the older buildings are on the National Register or contributors or LA landmarks. But then the side west of Hauser has mostly 1950s, 60s style architecture and later. And of course, LACMA is probably, going to be redone completely. My daughter said, she's 19, and she said, it's weird to think about LACMA that I know because she used to be dragged to the museum despite her better interests. But she grew up with LACMA. The LACMA I grew up with, she says, is probably going to be gone and there's going to be something else there. But anyway, to come back, I wonder if this area of Miracle Mile might become this kind of a wall canyon of very tall, very massive buildings. What's your thinking about this?
I think it's likely, partly because, look, Wilshire and Fairfax is destined to become a subway stop.
Yes.
And the MTA, the largest component of their real estate strategy is to monetize the properties that they condemn by bringing in developers after the fact, after the subway is completed. And that's the formula for that on this stretch of Wilshire is to go up as high as you can. As far as I know, I don't believe there are any height limits. I think you could come in here with Donald Trump and say, I'm going to build the world's tallest building. And as far as I think by right, they could do it. They may have structural problems, they may have soils problems, they may have all kinds of problems. And it may be that the station box can't support that sort of thing. But
you're saying that
they're going
the
up.
sky is the limit.
The sky is the limit. And you also have the 900-pound gorilla on the block. That's LACMA. LACMA owns the parking lot, the one remaining really big parking lot at Spalding and Wilshire. Mm-hmm. And they've wanted to develop that for decades. I know that, for example, they went to Philip Johnson in the early 1980s, and he conceived of I believe it was a 23-story skyscraper there. That was the early 80s, and you can well imagine it's going to be taller than that when they're through, figuring out how to make that one work. But that will happen. And then the stretch from Ogden? Yeah, it covers, all right, Ogden to Orange Grove. Yeah, Ogden to Orange Grove. That's because those buildings are going to be flattened, and it's going to go all the way back. I don't know how many feet back that's going to go, 200 feet, maybe more, maybe 300 feet from Wilshire frontage.
Southward.
Yeah, southward. That's primo real estate. And Alan Cerroti, who owns the building that's in the middle of that, I know that he's trying to work with LACMA to develop, to get a development deal with the MTA in place, and they're looking to go up.
Transit-oriented development.
Yeah, but in the case of, I have to say, in LACMA's defense, I think I would rather see them as a player than, half of the other developers in this town. Because if you look at the TODs, the transit-oriented developments that have been achieved in LA, you wince. It's just really, really bad architecture. I don't know that anyone, I can't think of one spot that they've done where you want to go, yeah, they've done it right.
There is a large apartment structure over the Wilshire Vermont station, which probably is of the type that you are discussing, or maybe more massive. The interesting thing, even though it has nothing to do with Miracle Mile, is the mural on it, which I think quite a few people might take as a commercial mural, but it is not. It's a piece of public art. I guess, I don't know if it was funded partly by the MTA or through other means.
Or the 1% set aside that the developer has to give.
So it may have been the CRA, but in any case, I don't know whether the ordinances, the city ordinances or metro ordinances to beautify the environment will get funded or continue, because there is really not much oversight of that anymore with the demolition of, the real demolition of the Community Redevelopment Agency. But I've also wondered in the past, again, because I haven't been to Miracle Mile, around Miracle Mile for that many years, as to why there are so few works of public art. And some of them are transitory, some of them are very modern. I know at least one was removed probably because it was problematic. It was the fountain. I think it was by Claire Falkenstein. And I did see a picture of it, so I can sort of imagine how it caused an outcry. Although it would have been interesting if it would have survived through times. And I don't know.
Why did that? It was a wave, kind of.
It was
copper,
and some glass, but it was very large.
It was at the corner of Hauser and Wilshire.
And now there is a very corporate kind of a fountain that is
gurgles away.
Yeah, and it's all very nice.
Well, across the street at the Prudential Building, or whatever they call that now,
is the Demetrios, the clothespin.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we did lose the other fountain at La Brea and Wilshire, which, who was the artist?
Taki.
Yeah, right. And it was that really elaborate
kind of like
copper,
a screen with
exactly.
Very large. Yeah.
And it was a fountain too. It originally had water coursing through it.
Which I've never seen it when I passed by it as a fountain. So I think by the time I started paying attention, it was almost like a grate.
That's right.
What it looked
and
like.
I wonder what became of it, because I thought that when they tore down that building, they were required to preserve it.
I don't know, and maybe it is sitting in storage. Maybe I know somebody bought the piece of the large stained glass that was in the building, but I don't know what happened to the fountain. And Taki himself, there is very little information about him.
Right.
So I don't know if there's an estate or anything like that. I don't know what happened to it.
I don't know. The question of public art, it hasn't been built into the DNA of Los Angeles. And when the Miracle, as you could tell the story better than I can, when the Miracle Mile developed, the buildings themselves were meant as the statements that were supposed to lend a kind of art or character to the neighborhood. And I don't think that other than if you were to hang something on the walls on the inside, as banks used to do, and
there wasn't really a move to beautify. What's also interesting that as part of the development of Miracle Mile, there wasn't really, I don't think there was a whole lot of discussion about what we now call landscaping as opposed to hardscaping. Although I think that was part of the development of Wilshire Boulevard in its early stages to make it more of a parkway. And there were various plans for that, not just for Wilshire, but in the rest of LA, as the exhibition you curated does show. This would have been very interesting, by the way, to think about LA and what would have happened to its green parkways over time. I'm nostalgic for the idea, but I'm not sure, I don't know how it would have worked out in the context of the city just so spreading so quickly outward. This example of the real abandonment of an urban core, which wasn't really large and isn't very large in relation to the rest of the city. But anyway, to stick to the Miracle Mile, there wasn't really a discussion, I don't think, of landscaping or, as you said, parks, but even just conventional landscaping. So it is in some ways an urban environment, not dense enough perhaps, although density in LA is an interesting question. I don't think Los Angeles likes density. But we think of Manhattan, there isn't a whole lot of greenery in Manhattan outside of Central Park and parks and maybe some areas by the rivers. But Miracle Mile is a piece of a city, except that it's kind of medium density at this point, so it's not quite like that.
Well, we are, the interesting thing, we're talking about Wilshire Boulevard, but the Miracle Mile is also wider than Wilshire Boulevard. It embraces a neighborhood, and the neighborhood was zoned in a very particular way, much as the rest of LA was. I think that the highest zoning here for the long time was R2-3, meaning you could cram a third unit on top of a garage. But that was the maximum. And the lots were divided either 50 by 150, which I think is basically the largest footprint for the lots around here. And then some of them are smaller, particularly around south of 8th Street. Those tend to be more like 50 by 135. Some of them, in fact, on Allendale, I think are 50 by 115.
So they're
and so when you talk about density, that's south of the boulevard. North of the boulevard, you have between Wilshire and 6th Street, for the first long stretch of it, that was all Hancock's oil field, and eventually park, and then the May Company was built. So it never had a particularly high density. And then from Curson to Hauser, much of that originally was also large buildings facing the boulevard and parking to the north. It wasn't until you got to Hauser that you got a much higher density. And I don't know what that is, but there's 6, 8, even maybe 12 unit apartment buildings there. But that was it. That's not Manhattan level of density.
No.
And because it was relatively, and I think it remains relatively middle class, you don't have the phenomenon that you have in a place like Pico Union, where you have the highest densities in the country in a neighborhood that looks to be much lower density than in fact it is. So